Assalamu alaikum and welcome to In the Company of Scholars. In the studio today we have two guests, Amar Amanet and my brother Asim Al-Hakim. Both of the scholars today will be speaking on the subject of marriage, and we're sure it will be interesting because marriage is something that many of us have to face, and so we need to have advice from the scholars before we get into something like that. Today we have many websites and interaction with people on cell phones and other media where they seem to speak with the opposite sex quite a bit. Now, how do we go in the 21st century as far as communication is concerned with the opposite sex via these media? Is it permissible for us to use the internet? Is it permissible for us to use the cell phone chat rooms and things like that? What is the view on the scholars on that specific subject?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillahi wa alihi wa sahbihi man ihtada bihudah. First of all, I believe that it is important to emphasize the fact, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Islam promotes and encourages prearranged marriages in the sense that it forbids relationships before marriage, simply because the cons are far greater than the pros when you have a relationship before marriage. And that is why prearranged marriages mean that you have to, and this is a misconception that a lot of the non-Muslims may think of prearranged marriage. They think that this means that a woman is married against her will, without knowing her future spouse to be, without having any say in that. And all of this is not the case. In Islam, we need two permissions to get the marriage going, and that is the consent of the woman, the girl to be married, and the consent of her guardian, her wali, who's usually the father. So there isn't any forced marriage. No girl can be forced to get married. She simply says no, that's it. But if she were to choose someone she likes and she would like to get married to, this cannot be without the approval of her guardian, so that it would balance the emotions in exchange to the benefits or whatever it can be measured. So if we look at it from this perspective, then we can talk more about the chat rooms, about the websites that conduct marriages and arranges marriages.
So what you're saying is that with these websites, people send their profile and they send their picture and they tell a little bit about themselves and they hope to find somebody of the opposite sex that they can hook up with or marry or get to know. How should it be done? First of all, is it permissible? And secondly, if you wanted to join, how would you do it?
Well,
what is the right way that you should do?
I believe that you cannot have a one size that fits all. So we cannot generalize and say it's permissible, and we cannot say it's not. You have to look at each and every process individually and separately. If the Islamic conditions and the things that Islam forbids were avoided, the precautions were there, then alhamdulillah, it's okay. For example, I've heard about a number of websites in the state where it became like a dating service. So the guy goes in, he surfs the net, and he goes to this website, he looks at the photograph of the girl, he gets her email, he gets her mobile, and he claims to be interested in getting married. He gets her contacts, he contacts her, and they exchange, conversations, chatting, maybe pictures, and maybe they meet. They go to the extent of meeting in some place, just, with the intention of getting married. This is what shaitan wants. And this is completely out of the question. No one allows his daughter or sister to do such a thing or engage in such a thing, because eventually it will lead to haram, to something that's not permissible. But if a person posts his or her profile and you have a committee of trustworthy people looking after such proposals and profiles, and they match profiles together, and once there is an agreement or primary, in a sense, consent, they follow it from there with the guardians of the girl, and he meets the man, and it becomes a normal engagement. This is, inshallah, permissible.
Brother Amar, what came up in the topic was that we still have to follow traditional values. We still have to follow the values that are spoken about in the Sunnah and Quran. But today we have a lot of people modernizing, wanting to modernize Islam, and they wanting to say, well, we need to look at the modern approach to marriage. For example, in the USA versus South Asia, you have different concepts of marriage, how marriage should be entered into. What should we do in America? Should we use the same traditional values as we would in South Asia? How would you get that across?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam wa rasulullah. It's very difficult to know what people mean when they say traditional values. And first of all, I would say that marriage is a fundamental necessity in Islam. And so it has a high priority over many, many practices that have been instituted to help people be married. So we find in the reality in the Muslim world today, anywhere you go, many so-called traditional practices are actually barriers preventing people from doing their Islamic duty, so that people delay marriage till midlife, far beyond the age in which it is a necessity for them to be married. And so many traditional practices actually open the doors for shaitan, that people have to find something, some path outside of marriage to solve their natural desires that are part of human nature. And so I'm afraid of that word tradition. What we have today, for example, in the West, are millions of Muslims who live very often as individuals who don't have a support system from family and relatives and community. And so they're looking for marriage for an Islamic reason as Muslims. They're free in the society to go out and do anything they want. The reason that these Islamic websites and such have been established, whether they're perfect or not, I mean, obviously one would have to look at the details of each particular site, but they've been there to meet an Islamic fundamental need, which is a human need, and people want to find Islamic solutions for their problems. That's the only reason they're going there. Because, of course, if they were only going there to look for something wrong, they could do that elsewhere. But, as the Sheikh pointed out, there are temptations and dangers inherent there. And so Islam advises that if two people are looking for marriage, they don't meet unless they're under supervision or a chaperone of an elder, hopefully relative of the bride, or somebody appointed by her family, or leader appointed by the community to chaperone that process. And so in the Muslim community today, we try to provide people with, depending on their particular situation, solutions that will fit them. So there are people who have a strong family, and they're part of a cultural group that has related cultural group. It's easy for them to, as you said, arrange marriages, which basically in Islam, to clarify what that means, it means arranging meetings between the young man and young woman so they can see whether they are compatible with each other under supervision of the family. So somebody comes, for example, from South Asia, and they're in a community where there are many, many hundreds of families from the same area, and they have the same cultural background. That's very easy. But there are also many Muslims who do not have that. So they have to find some other alternative. And I used to be very suspicious, and I still have a lot of reservation about the internet websites. But I know that many very good people with the right intention have been successfully married on those sites. And so I don't believe that the primary reason they exist is to undermine the teachings of Islam, but to find a way of living as a Muslim under circumstances that may be not ideal.
Well, when we come back from the break, we're going to carry on looking at the subject of marriage, and we're going to look at the dowry system and how it affects Muslims today. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. We are discussing marriage. Today we have been looking at different aspects of marriage, and we're going to now talk about something that is well known in Asia and Africa, and that is the dowry system. Paying money or paying in cows or paying in cattle for the person that you want to marry. How does that fit into Islam? So we're going to look at this and speak to our scholars here and see what they have to say on the specific subject. Should someone be forced to pay, for example, in Africa, they have to pay 40 cows for the wife that they want to marry?
40 cows is a lot. First of all, we're looking at the topic marriage. We're not looking into marriage. None of us is interested. Not anymore, for God's sake. But I believe, Brother Ammar, he was just talking about the definition of dowry. I know dowry in Arabic. So we know that the dowry is mahar, or as mentioned in the Quran, sadaq, which is something that is mainly or usually physical, given to the bride-to-be. And in Islam, this is the trend. Now, I believe that other countries have it the other way around.
Yeah. Dowry is actually a word that refers to money that must be paid by the family of the bride to the husband. This is an un-Islamic practice. It was practiced formerly in Europe, still practiced today in Asia and Africa, where the husband is doing a favor for the woman by taking her off the hands of her family, and now she comes and lives in his household among his family. So basically the woman goes from being the servant to her father and her parents to becoming the servant to her in-laws. And if the proper dowry is not paid, and if they ask for more dowry and are not given it, then she can be abused, she can be even sometimes killed, because she is considered basically worthless. And she is not a proper daughter-in-law, and she's not serving the family properly. And in Islam, what you call mahar, or sadaq, is actually how the husband demonstrates his capability of caring for and supporting his wife and his seriousness in taking her as a wife with the intention of being married to her for life. And so he gives her a monetary gift, something of value, money, gold, silver. It could be anything depending on the culture. Most of us don't have room for cows. You know, at my house, they don't allow us to have cows, unfortunately.
Not to mention what the husband has to pay in forms of furniture, renting the house, and the whole 9 yards. It's not only the mahar, is it?
Yeah. The Muslim husband is required to support the wife, and he's required to provide housing, food, clothing, according to the custom of the society, on a level that is expected of a normal person of his culture. And by giving mahar, he is showing his seriousness of purpose, that he's not there on a date, but he's there committed. And so it shows respect to the family and his commitment to the marriage. And so it's much different than the dowry system, and it's a positive system. Now, it can be abused, and I think in some Muslim countries, it is so high, it is set so high that it's almost impossible for most young men to get married without a lot of assistance. And maybe you could tell us more about that.
I believe that this is a fact in a lot of where I come from, in the Arab countries. They seem to boast about it, and they brag about it, that I've paid this much of a mahar, a dowry to my wife. Or it's the opposite way around. The father of the bride-to-be says, I demand that I get much so-and-so in money. And it is way beyond the capability of the young man interested in getting married. And this, unfortunately, deters a lot from getting married. And one thing that I'd like to point out, which is in Islam, it's a religion of simplicity, in the sense, the more people need something, Allah Azza wa Jal, the Almighty, makes it easy for them. For example, everyone needs to breathe, so air is free. Everyone needs to drink, but not as they need to breathe. So water is available, but it's not as easy as air. Everyone dies, and we're talking about marriage, but there's no simulation, none whatsoever. I love my wife, so don't get me wrong. But if you look at death, it's inevitable. Everybody's going to die. That's why death in Islam is easy. To prepare a dead person, wash him, perfume him, wrap him in his sheets, pray funeral prayer, take him to the grave. In a matter of an hour or two, it's over.
We can't die in America till we can afford the taxes for death. Then when we get the money together for the tax, then we can die. Not before that. So it's not quite so easy. But the thing that you pointed out was that marriage is a necessity, and people are physically and emotionally ready to get married at a very young age. If you put financial obstacles, what you're doing is preventing people from doing what God Almighty has made them to desire, and it is a physical and mental necessity for them. And so people are putting off marriage until they're in their 30s, when they're physically ready to get married at 18 or at whatever age.
Yeah, bearing in mind that Islam promotes to make the wedding as simple as possible and not to have any expenses. And that's why the Prophet said, alayhi salam, the best blessed marriages are those the easiest, so that it would not become a deterrent to youngsters. I've seen a lot of the young men not being able to marry until they're 26 or 27 years of age. And they have wealthy parents. And when I talk to the father, he says, I'd like him to depend on himself. Until he gets a job, he's able to support himself on his own. And this is, I believe that this is wrong. Because he could be 19 years old or 18 years old. He can be dependent upon, reliable person, but he cannot afford to get married. So why deprive him from this right? We feed him, we clothe him, we shelter him, but we don't allow him to get married, which is something that is natural, and it's a driving force that could take him into wrong places.
Today we have a world without borders. We all communicate with each other. We have people from all different countries living in each other's countries. There's no longer just Americans in America, or just South Africans in South Africa, or just Saudis in Saudi Arabia. The world is becoming a universal global village. Intercontinental relationships and marriages becoming modern in today's world. And people are marrying from one continent to the other. How successful do you think those type of relationships or marriages will be? If you're marrying someone from America and you from China.
You know, mashallah, there's a lot of obstacles, and a lot of those marriages are not successful. And there's a higher percentage of divorce among people who are married from between cultures and nations. That's because part of the marriage is not simply the sincerity of the couple, but they have their cultural baggage, they have their expectations. What is the role of the husband? What is the role of the wife? The role of the relatives, the extended family, what role do they play in the marriage? Very often, the in-laws are directly involved in many cultures in the daily life and decisions of the couple. Many of us want to be totally independent when we're married and not take orders from our parents or our in-laws. And so a couple who get married and have not discussed these things in detail in advance of the marriage and decided in advance how they're going to do, how they're going to make decisions, they are often in trouble. So it's very important today that they get counseling and advice from people with experience so they can be prepared for the possibility of a conflict arising in their marriage. It's bound to happen. There's not really a question, but Allah knows these things are extremely common.
If I may add, I believe this has nothing to do with Islam. It is a cultural thing, because even if two to get married and they're the best of da'is and scholars and their knowledge, the woman comes from the east, the man comes from the west, if they live somewhere, it has nothing to do with Islam. The woman feels homesick. She's away from her parents, from her loved ones, relatives, friends. She's in a new environment, community, city. She loves her husband greatly, but she has 24 hours a day, and she only sees him for like 6 or 7 hours, and the rest of the day, she doesn't know what to do. So I don't think it's an Islamic issue, but it's more of a cultural or social issue that should be tackled. Even if you get counseling before marriage, we can all sign on contract papers and agreeing and prenuptials and so on. But at the end of the day, it's the four walls I'm stuck in, and if I don't have something to occupy me and take the load of my thinking, the pressure, then there's bound to be a problem, unless Allah Azza wa Jal chooses otherwise.
We have people migrate all over the world. So they are living in the same place, and that's their home, but they come from some other place originally, or their family came from somewhere else. And so when you're a young person, obviously you're not married. When you get married, usually you have an idea of marriage which you receive from your parents and your relatives. And that can be very different from one place to another, even among Muslims. And your family also, for example, some cultures, as I said, the bride is expected to be very obedient and submissive to her in-laws. And so they can be very demanding and expect that she will spend all of her free time, for example, with her mother-in-law, perhaps every single day. And things like that arise from time to time. And so Muslims often think that since we're all Muslims, we're not going to have these problems, but that's not true. You have to talk about them and just, be aware of them in advance and decide how you're going to deal with things. And so it's not just about homesickness, but the fact that our idea of home is a different idea.
But I think that if this is the case, if they're all from the same home, that is, let's say, the States, they all migrated to the U.S., and now this is home for them, then the cultural differences, I think it will eventually evolve. Both of them, they'll be conditioned to each other. What I was referring to, if you're having someone move into your culture or your country.
This is a topic that needs a lot of discussion, and we need to go into it in more depth in the future, inshallah. As we see that, basically to give an overview, website dating, website online marriages, we need to look very carefully at what sites we choose. Traditional versus modern arranged marriages need to be consulted with people, or respected people in our community before we just go ahead with them. And arranged marriages, especially intercontinental arranged marriages, we need to make sure that we also speak to elders about these things. So next time we come back, and we can continue on the subject, and inshallah we can go into more detail. Thank my two guests that have been with us today. Thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.